Hey, and welcome back to the RSA Broadcast Alley. This is our seventh micro interview of the day. And today, for this interview, we're talking to Paul McKay, a principal analyst with Forrester. Welcome, Paul.
Good to meet you, Adrian. How are you today?
I'm very good. I believe you're over in the UK, so a little bit later in the day for you.
Yeah, that's right. It's just coming into late evening here in the UK, but I'm enjoying trying to keep up to scratch with the RSA show, but mostly on demand, obviously, given that a lot of stuff happens through the night.
Right. Yeah, and there is a lot going on. I think yesterday I looked at the first round of tracks, and they were 17 deep, 17 going on simultaneously. So I get a little bit of decision fatigue going on there when trying to choose what to watch.
Yeah, I think it's always a challenge with even the physical event when we used to be able to do that sort of thing. If you remember back 15 months ago, it's trying to figure out what to spend your time with, isn't it?
Yeah, if you're in South Moscone and you want to watch something in West that's back to back, it's not going to happen. You're going to miss part of that next talk.
Absolutely no chance. But anyway, Here we are in our bedrooms and kitchen tables and all that sort of stuff.
Indeed, I might have teenagers walking around behind me at some point. So, yeah, it's how things are now. So it sounds like we are interested in some similar markets. The security, I tend to call it security scorecard because one of the vendors, that's its name. But the risk scorecard market is a very interesting one. In InfoSec, certainly I think it's an entirely new category. We hadn't really seen anyone else go after trying to objectively rank the security of or risk of third parties. If you give us a bit of an intro and kind of how you see the market and how you define that market.
Sure. So I guess from my perspective as the analyst, along with a colleague, Ala Valente, who covers this market, I guess a couple of things that kind of stick to mind for me is that there's a lot of similarities with this market in terms of how it looks at externally visible information in the same way that, for example, a similar category like attack surface management does. But what they try and do with that data is combine it together into some kind of proprietary algorithm and use that data to infer a cyber risk score on a scale that looks very much like a credit rating. So you'll find some firms use like the Experian type rating of 300 to 700 type of thing. Others will use an A, B, C, or D rating. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter how they label these things. The important thing is that they're trying to look at organizations that they can find things on from an external footprint on the internet and use those different elements to combine areas like, for example, security patching or the level of vulnerabilities that are present on the internet, level of disclosed protocols, and also that even some statements on what they have in their publicly facing literature around the security compliance and standards that they operate. And even some of the providers will even start to look at financial quantification data as part of this as well. So you actually see quite a wide diversity of approaches to doing this. But I guess how we look at this is that, first of all, there's a core and publicly available methodology for how they combine those data points to produce the score. It's publicly available. The methodology is transparent, and there's a way of correcting errors in a fair and free manner from a publicly available information dispute. So if you see something in that rating that you don't agree with, or you think doesn't belong with you, then you should be able to dispute that fairly and transparently.
Right. And do they break down so I've yet to dig into this, so I have all kinds of questions about how they actually do it. Do they break down the score in such a way that you can put weightings around what you care about more or less when looking at those scores?
They give you an idea of the relative priority that they assign to the scores. So they will, in some cases, they will give you a list of all the different rating data points that they make the rating on, and some of them give you the weighting that they apply to each of those, and some of them do not, and they keep that information private. So actually, for some of them, it's a bit of a black box. But from the evaluation that we conducted, which completed at the end of February this year, we found that generally speaking, clients are not really able to look at changing the rating in any way or changing the weightings in the methodology itself. That's completely done by the ratings firm themselves in those cases. But what you will find is that you can, for example, choose subsections of the rating entity that you're looking at. So if you're looking at yourself, for example, and you're only interested in a specific business unit, you can reduce the scope of what you're looking at to just that entity. And the same with a third party as well.
Okay. Yeah, and it's interesting. You described this market as quite polarizing with customers. Your examples were Marmite and spam as things that are polarizing. I might have gone with eggnog and sushi, not together, but it's just two different things that I find people are polarized around. Either they love it or hate it. There's not a whole lot that are in between or on the fence. And it's interesting. So I think a lot of folks I've talked to agree that as a sole score, it's maybe not enough, to make a decision about a vendor. But I've heard a lot of people talk more around, as one of many factors that you're considering when thinking about doing business with a vendor. That it fits into a larger calculation. How do you see customers actually using these scores?
Yes, I think in terms of how we see customers using them, there are two kind of primary use cases that I think people look at. One is the exactly what you just said, which is really around using it as part of the third-party risk evaluation process for looking at the security posture of a potential vendor that you're bringing into play. And I guess there's two things I'd say that makes them quite useful. One is that you can implement a form of continuous monitoring with it, which obviously is very difficult to do using a traditional audit or the usual kind of tools we'd use in a TPRM software suite. So that's one area where I think people have found them generally to be pretty useful. And I guess the other thing that we would also say is that, again, it's about how that's played into the wider process. So where we find people find the data quite helpful is that often it finds security issues that we weren't previously aware of, and even sometimes the vendors weren't aware of, and you actually help improve the security of both yourself and also the vendor in a way that helps everybody. So that can be quite a positive thing. But I guess the bit that is really important to emphasize here is that no customer fully relies on these ratings. It's simply an indication that helps them decide whether they need to do additional forms of due diligence, whether that be going through and doing an on-site audit or a remote audit or asking probing questions about certain areas. And I guess what you'll find is that if you take any kind of standard security questionnaire or a third-party questionnaire, whether it's based on NIST or ISO or the SIG groups questionnaire, you'll find that they actually, between about 25 to 35% of the data that's collected by a ratings firm can help you influence or even fully influence whether the data that's available in the public domain about that firm corresponds with the statements in a vendor's questionnaire where they say, hey, we're great, we patch everything and we're all hunky-dory. You actually have some data points that act as a counterpoint. I think that's quite helpful, and we see people using it in that way as well. The other way that people use it, I think, and there's a lot of noise about lots of different use cases, but I think the other major thing that we see is people looking at doing the same kind of thing, but they're for their own enterprise. So if you've got a very heavily federated organization with lots of different business units in a very globally distributed organization, which is quite common here in Europe where I'm based, to find organizations that have come together via M&A and they have a very complicated legal structure. Often security teams that sit in the group function will use these tools to help them to figure out whether their business units are telling them the truth about the real posture of their security, and that can be quite helpful too when doing it for your own internal security management as well.
I've often heard it said, that the adversary that some organizations fear the most is the auditor. And in this case, I do worry somewhat about us getting into that age-old compliance issue where the security team's efforts might be redirected away from things that are more security issues, more critical for keeping actual adversaries out and more focused on making sure we get a good score. Do you see that being a concern here with, certainly, if you feel like your score is wrong, if it's based on some false positives, you now have to dedicate some time and resources to correcting that, right?
Yeah, now this is probably the biggest criticism that gets leveled against this market, which is that, in essence, while many of them have publicly available dispute resolution processes, it's them and them alone that decide whether they're going to accept your correction or not. And there's certainly a lot of accusations of them playing God in how they do that, and they're not always fully transparent about why they've chosen to reject something. some of the worst offenders in the market also will actually say, "Hey, we can also help you to improve your score if you come and pay us," which is obviously a little bit, a little bit sneaky, really, of some of them.
Yeah,
but I think that the
bit of a protection racket.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. But I think from my perspective, the main bit that I think people need to focus on with respect to the dispute resolution process is that, yes, these things come out with false positives. Yes, they're quite noisy. But I think that what I've seen people do with these solutions is that they take them and look at the results you achieve from them in a very caveated fashion. I guess one of the things that I worry about as a general security practitioner, aside from my industry analyst hat, is that one of the things we see people doing with these solutions is showing the scores and the benchmark around how your firm does against your industry to the boards of directors as a way of trying to level the conversation with having something fairly simple like a rating with a number that goes up and down over time, and you can see how you're doing and how the outside world sees you. And that's great in terms of taking a non-technical view into the boardroom, but what it does, which I think is somewhat troublesome, is that boardroom execs, when they see that they're behind their peers as measured by these ratings platforms, will be somewhat challenged in thinking, well, hey, we need to get that score better. How do we do that? And that's where the compliance danger comes in, where you start managing to the score and getting the score better rather than actually looking at your security program. And the security program actually, if you do the right things, should sort the score out itself anyway, as long as you're focusing on the right things, because most of these scores are based on things that I would generally consider to be typical security hygiene.
So in the vulnerability management market, we've seen some trends over the years, that I wonder if some of those will be mirrored in this market, in the I guess for short you call this the CSR market.
Yeah, that's right.
And in vulnerability scans, at some point we realized, okay, authenticated scans are going to give us more accurate results. So do we see this, is it happening now, or do we see in the future where, this market where, organizations might offer to give more of an internal view or an inside view, like maybe we can give you some, I'm not sure what it would be, if it would be an agent, that you'd install somewhere, or output from a scanner, which still have their false positives and issues. But where do you see this moving in the future in terms of trying to make that score more accurate, more useful from a security standpoint?
Sure. So I think so speaking with the providers in this market on a fairly regular basis, as I do, I know that some of them are actually thinking about how do they do that themselves already at the moment. I guess a couple of things that I foresee happening here is I absolutely do see at some stage in the future that there are certain firms, particularly if you think about IT service providers, who typically get clobbered by these scores. And you look at a firm like Microsoft, and most of the ratings firms will show you that Microsoft have terrible security according to them. Often what's being picked up is the fact that the customers that have, say, for example, things on Azure have terrible security, and that drags Microsoft down with it, which is obviously a little bit of a distraction for most clients to look at. But for firms like that, service providers, professional services firms and the like, it's actually a business imperative, I think, for them to demonstrate to the outside world that they're managing their score and they're looking at not just securing their external presence, but also really looking to deliver on their commitment to keep their client's data secure. And I guess one of the things I'd say here is that I do feel quite strongly that this is going to come at some point in the future where the option to upload certain types of data will come into play. But I guess what I would expect to see is that either that's done to help assuage stakeholder concerns, particularly around strengthening security compliance mandates. For example, if you're looking to show how great you are at doing things like ISO, for example. But I guess a more meaningful thing for me would be if you could use some internal insight of these data to actually provide more assurance over some of the statements that you make in your 10K statement, or in the UK, I would call this an annual report and account, for your corporate governance statements as part of ESG efforts for your kind of broader commitments to stakeholders. So I think it's going to come, but I guess where the firms are struggling a little bit at the moment, and I agree with them on this, is that the advantage of doing the kind of, if we want to use the analogy of the vulnerability market, the unauthenticated scans, is that you can do that across everyone and you can have broadly comparable data points in a kind of standardized methodology. you would have to think very carefully about what kind of data points you would get internally, and the information upload would always have to be voluntary. So there's a school of thought that says you can add that for additional information and context, but would you actually make that a part of the algorithm? Because you can't guarantee that you're comparing apples with apples across two organizations that maybe sit within different industries, or they're in the same industry but they have completely different security footprints and have uploaded different types of data. So that's some of the problems that the providers are trying to grapple with, and I think they're trying to tread cautiously to make sure that they don't make any kind of strategic errors on how they do that, because that could change the profile of the scoring for quite a lot of firms that rely on these things.
Yeah, you bring up some good points there. I think on the attack surface management side, they call that asset attribution. You know, like I remember when doing our testing, we found, one of them just throws all your assets on a map. And we were like, we don't have anything in Holland or in Brazil, and what it is we use Office 365. So, it's pulling in all those assets, as assets we own. And certainly, one of the things that was interesting is, a lot of the places where our DNS points are not assets that we control directly, but they are our third parties. So from an outside perspective, if you were to turn that into a score, that would be someone else using our services. That would be their fourth party. And on and on and on. So, for getting our podcasts distributed out there, we use Libsyn, and then Libsyn uses AWS, let's say. I forget exactly which infrastructure as a service provider they were using. But you have this rabbit hole that you go down where, how deep do you go with that? Do you go to the point where you find out they're using SolarWinds and, you're pulling SolarWinds score into account? It's because I know some of these vendors like to say, oh, we would have caught that, when some of these big incidents occur, so how deep down that rabbit hole does this score go? And how deep, would you advise someone to go from a customer standpoint of the CSR products?
Okay, so I think one of the things I'd say here is that a lot of the products can have the capability to try and do some kind of discovery of fourth parties through what they can see from the kind of examples you highlighted. Like, for example, okay, this DNS points to a third-party provider. What's that doing? What are they hosting themselves on, and so forth? So you can do that, and you can go down a rabbit hole with them. But of course, one of the limitations on that from a customer's viewpoint, which is why I think you have to prioritize your third-party program before you start looking to build this in from a continuous monitoring perspective, is these solutions are quite expensive. The list price for these things per rated entity can list from between $500 at the lowest end up to $3,000 for the top end. So if you start scaling this to your third-party program and start doing fourth parties, then parties, this is going to get damn expensive pretty quickly. And I guess what we would advise is that I think what some of the firms actually already have is that they now are starting to introduce some of the kind of tools that you would expect to see around, based on the profile of what this firm does for you and what it does for some of the customers. We think this should be a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 firm, and it helps you try and prioritize which ones you'd be focusing your attention on. It doesn't always get it right, but it's a good starting point. So I guess from my perspective, I would be saying to most customers, you need to get a handle on your third parties first and foremost, and have at least an understanding of which ones require continuous monitoring for these solutions, and you'll invest in the ratings platform saying we do that, which ones you can afford to maybe just check the score once a year or whatever, and you kind of go down in that kind of logical order. I guess you really ought to be focusing on your third parties first of all, and maybe fourth parties for some of the top rated third parties. So if you're relying on a particular hosting provider, for example, then you might want to dig a little bit deeper into what they're doing. But I think for most organizations, they need to be very pragmatic and very thoughtful about how they spend that money, because these solutions are not cheap.
Yeah, and the price, that's interesting about the pricing. So there's no all-you-can-eat or buffet tier here. It's all... Wow. Okay. You're buying each rating.
So this is one of the things that I have banged the drum about with this market.
And point in time as well. So if I want the same third-party vendor rating 4 times a year, do I have to pay for it 4 times?
Generally, how it works is they will they will look at it on a sliding scale. So if you're doing continuous monitoring, obviously that's the highest kind of rate. They'll look at having it's like a slot machine. You have a certain number of companies. You say to them, right, I want to monitor 1,000 companies a year. They'll then give you a volume discount on that, and then you pay per company that you monitor. And the level of intrusiveness in terms of whether you do that constantly or whether you do that less frequently, that also is a variable on the price as well. Some of the firms have more complicated models where you buy different packages, and that gets you different functionality enabled within the platform. Some are a little bit more flexible. There's one or two of them that are starting to do all-you-can-eat packages towards, I guess, the bottom end. Some of the smaller providers are kind of willing to do that to try and build up market share, and have got some pretty big numbers for some of the customer references that they submitted as part of the new wave evaluation. But I guess to some extent, some of the more, I guess, existing providers in the market have actually been doing this for quite a lot longer and still are evolving in terms of their ability to offer those kind of all-you-can-eat models. I think they have to at some stage, because there's no way that someone's going to spend $1 million on this kind of solution if you're like General Electric and you have hundreds of thousands of third parties. It just doesn't scale.
Yeah, and it's interesting on the ASM, on the attack surface management side, you see the same thing. You see some of the vendors in this space where if you pay for the product for the platform, you can look up anybody in their entire database. They scan the whole internet. They've got data on everybody out there, and you can just scan it to your heart's content. Whereas others don't actually do any scanning until after they onboard you. And then you can only see the data for yourself and your subsidiaries. And then even, step beyond that, some even require proof that you own that asset. So you have to put a special file on a web server or, special DNS text entry to prove ownership before they'll do any kind of scanning or asset discovery. So I find that I find the differences between these markets. I feel like you've justified, my choice to separate these out into.
I think it's important to separate them out, because we also see some of the vendors in the risk rating space also kind of say, well, actually, you could use our solution to do the kind of thing that attack surface management platform for doing. They're trying to kind of look into some of those use cases, and to be fair, you probably could use them in that way if you really wanted to. But I fundamentally view the way in which these solutions are being used and the buyers that are looking at these solutions is fundamentally different. In attack surface management, we're looking really at the boundary enumeration problem. We want to understand our internet footprint to help us manage our attack surface. In the ratings case, you're actually thinking about managing risk, and I think the audience is very different. You're typically talking to risk managers, third-party security managers, as well as the traditional CISO and SOC buyers as well. So for me, there's quite a clear delineation between the market, but what you often find is that they actually often go against each other in evaluation. So there is a bit of, I would say, adjacency and overlap between them.
They do. Yeah, and because of that, I think there is some pressure there on some of the attack surface management folks to step into the space and start putting together their own scoring algorithms.
Yeah, and I get that too, but I guess the kind of stretching the analogy to the credit markets somewhat, there's only so much trust that's going to go around. So the solutions that are in the market space at the moment, you'll find that there's space for maybe 3 or 4 vendors in this market tops in the next 5 years, because what's going to happen is that CISOs will consolidate around the vendors that offer the best functionality, the best workflow and integrations into the end-to-end security processes that they're trying to manage here, and also the ones that have the biggest market share and the best levels of trust within the wider industry. There's only 3 credit bureaus for a reason.
Right.
I think it's going to be a bit like that with this market. So anyone else trying to enter this market, I just would caution them as to whether it's really a good idea, to be honest.
That's an excellent point, because already in the ASM market, we're seeing that you could acquire 5 vendors and have some overlap with all of them. When we tested them, all of them found something unique, but the unique things they found were not unique among them. They were unique to each of them. So we could have combined all 9 and gotten something special that nobody else found from each of those 9. But yeah, what do you do if BitSight gives you an A and Security Scorecard gives you an F? It's like, you want to see some, you start to question the market if there's too much variance, I think, between scores and different vendors, and you don't want to have to check too many vendors, especially not at the costs that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things I would say that we noticed from speaking to customers is that customers, particularly the larger ones that are getting ratings from lots of the ratings firms thrown at them by some of their customers, often actually maintain more than one, precisely for the reason that you outlined, to look at how they're viewed by different ratings firms. Now, at least from what I could see within the evaluation that we ran, one of the things that we did was we actually got accounts for all of the platforms and logged into each of them and looked side by side at all of, we gave them like scenarios of different companies, and I was deliberately quite obtuse and picked really complicated, gnarly companies that I happened to know quite a lot about because I'd worked at them or had them as clients in my former professional life when I used to be a consultant. And what I found was that for companies, in the majority of cases, the overall rating was broadly similar, give or take a margin of error. But what was quite significant is that some of them didn't do the best job at handling service providers, where the security vulnerabilities and the flaws that they're finding in their data sets are actually as a result of poor customer security rather than because the hosting provider or the cloud service provider is doing anything wrong. So in those kind of situations, I think that you could see some quite large differences between the ratings firms, because some were penalizing people quite heavily for flaws that are customers and weren't allowing them to kind of be broken out, and others were kind of suppressing those and saying actually that's noise and it shouldn't be used as a representative for the overall company. So that was the main area where I did see some problems with some of the guys in this market. But on the whole, for an average company, they're reasonably similar. The thing that's different between each of them is that some have this view that the more data I throw at you, the better. That makes the rating better. I just think that increases the amount of noise that you have to wade through before you find the important stuff that you really need to focus on. And others have a slightly more limited view that look to prioritize the things that are most important, which is kind of what I would see is pretty important if I was looking to use these solutions myself in the day job.
Yeah. There's some fascinating techniques out there. I remember one of the vendors we tested looked for the copyright at the bottom of a web page as an indicator that, if it says copyright 2016 or even 2006, maybe that's an indicator that this website is abandoned. And I thought that was a very novel way of looking at it. And there's a whole bunch of novel, neat little tricks that they use to determine that. And then some of them look at data leaks, and some of them don't. So if you've got credentials leaked out there, if you have compromised accounts that could be used for cred stuffing, that's almost like a different category within attack surface management. So you're right. There's so much you could potentially look at, that you potentially end up with a lot of noise. But yeah, someone in the comments here in the Discord is saying that some or most of the platforms allow you to have free access to update or maintain your own score if you're a vendor. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that's that's correct. I guess one of the criticisms that was labelled at this market when it first came up was that it was seen as a little bit of a pay to play. So what most of them have now done is they've moved to a model where you can look at your score, and if a customer invites you, you can actually look at the issues that have been flagged and even do a bit of communication in some of them with your customers. But I guess what often then happens is that often these firms then end up becoming clients of these firms because they end up having more than one customer that will ask them about their BitSight, Security Scorecard, Risk Recon rating, or whoever. So I think it's certainly true that you do now have the ability to do that. But I guess that I would say that there are some operational difficulties with some of them. So some of them, for example, you can get access, but the link expires after 2 weeks, which if you're trying to do any kind of negotiation on whether we're going to do the remediation or not, or whether we agree with the findings in the first place, that's not really a huge amount of time. So the stuff like that, like if you, for example, if your contact at a vendor happened to be on a holiday when you sent that link, then it's just operationally a little bit of a pain in the ass to try and refresh that every now and again. So some of them are quite different in terms of the length of time that they allow that free access, and some are pretty relaxed about allowing you to have access for as long as you like, really.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we both agree that, certainly security teams need a better way to manage risk from third parties. And I guess only time will tell if this is going to be part of that solution. So far, it looks like it probably will be.
I think in some form, yes. I think it's now widely used enough, not just here in the US, but also actually internationally, here in Europe and also in APAC, that I think it's not going to go away as a category, but I think it does need to do a lot of growing up as a category. So in our security ratings new wave, we talk about the market not being ready for the prime time. And by that, what we mean is that it's still quite an immature space, and there's still a lot of growing up it needs to do in terms of being more transparent about its methodology, more robust with external validations of the models that they use, and more thoughtful about how the solution integrates with wider risk management workflows like GRC flows for enterprise risk management or third-party risk management, and not just being a kind of single platform that you use in isolation.
Agreed. And on that note, I think that's a good point to wrap this up. This has been Paul McKay with us, a principal analyst at Forrester Research. And coming to you from RSA's Broadcast Alley, we will be back with you. I, in fact, will be back with you in about 15 minutes. Paul?
It's been a pleasure to speak to you, Adrian. Thank you.